Plato versus Aristotle. Today's, although obviously the entire class series has to be viewed as a unified process, we want to especially consider what we're going to be discussing today directly related to what we discussed last week around the question of Plato. You really want to think of these two philosophical worldviews in comparison to each other simultaneously. The only way to actually understand the one is by having, or what I mean by the one is not the one with a capital O, but to understand one of the two philosophical systems is to have simultaneously in your mind's eye the other philosophical system. To really know what Aristotle is trying to do, you need to be thinking regularly about what it was that Plato had accomplished, and therefore what Aristotle was setting out to destroy. That's really the most significant thing in looking at this thing. And similarly, as we go through some Aristotle, I don't want to go through a huge amount. I'm going to go through a certain amount of Aristotle just so that you get a flavor of this, and then we'll proceed to look at some more modern Aristotelians, not current time Aristotelians, but some of the period of Adam Smith, in particular David Hume, and a couple of other exponents of British philosophical radicalism, empiricism, to get an idea of what Aristotelianism actually looks like in action in a format that you might be a little bit more familiar with. But in any event, as we go through this today, you want to really keep in mind what we discussed in the last class in terms of the way Plato laid out the central concept of what he was discussing, especially in the Republic, which is what is the truth, how do you know it, what is knowledge? And he developed a concept, as you'll remember from our discussion of the divided line, of ascending levels of decreasing imperfection. That is to say, a method of the higher hypothesis, of generation of explanations, a hypothesis, of cause and effect relationship between the one and the many, where he began from that which is merely apparent, mere appearances in the world, what the sense perceptions receive, and he explains that you have to use that perhaps as the raw material for your mental activity. That is to say, it's the raw material which the subjective process, the reasoning process, uses to generate a hypothesis, which is then superseded by a higher hypothesis, and that in turn by a higher hypothesis. And that process of higher hypothesis generation itself then becomes the subject of the reasoning mind. That itself, that process of hypothesis generation, becomes the thought object of the mental process, and that becomes the actual basis of true knowledge. That is to say, the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, the method whereby higher hypotheses are generated. And this, for Plato, of course, is a process of constant unending change, but not simply change in the sense that something is always different than it was before, but change that reflects a unitary, unifying process of development which generates each of the moments in that process of change. And then he lays out the idea that the entirety of this knowable universe, which is the universe of the becoming, right, is the universe of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. That entire created universe is itself the product of the unhypothesized absolute principle, which is Plato's concept of God. There is an absolute, unchanging, unhypothesized principle, which he calls the good, which is to the world of thinking the same way that the sun is to the world of visible things. Remember, that was the metaphor that he developed, that idea, that image to have in your mind as to what you're looking for when you're trying to find out what the good is, the absolute good. So that, just by way of brief recapitulation of what we were looking at in the case of Plato, and also, just to refresh your memory in terms of the parable of the cave, this crucial concept of projection, the crucial idea of projection, that what one perceives, that which is attainable to man's senses in physical space-time, is itself only a projection onto, as in the wall of a cave, onto a lower dimensionality of a continuous process which is occurring in a higher dimensionality. And although we cannot directly exceed get access to that higher dimensionality process through our sensory apparatus per se, nonetheless, our reasoning apparatus can allow us to conceptualize that which must have produced the projection which we do perceive with our senses. So the projection is not true in itself, nor is it false in itself. It is simply the projection onto a screen, onto n dimensions of a process that actually occurs on n+1 dimensions or n+2 dimensions. And that's the important metaphor again. None of this is an idea which you can nail down and say, okay, that is exactly what he means. He's giving you, in a certain sense, an image, an idea, a metaphor, because what he's trying to do is to trigger in us, his readers, a process of concept formation in our own minds to generate for ourselves the idea that he's working with and he's trying to get at. So he comes up with a bunch of different ideas of images or metaphors or ways of inducing in the reader the formation of ideas for him or herself, which are the same process that Plato himself went through. And the cave parable is exactly that. It's to give you the idea of how to think about finding the truth in that which is merely transitory and apparent. Okay? So any questions about that in terms of Plato, just recalling what we had discussed last week before we proceed to go into Aristotle? All clear? No problem? No sweat?
I just have a comment.
Sure.
In the New Testament in particular, there's so many instances of exactly what you just, the word you used, parable. It's full of reference to parable and the use of parable.
Right. Which speaks in itself, let alone for someone who's schooled in Plato's thought, but that speaks in itself to the absurdity of those who would try to read the Bible as if it were a computer manual, right? That it has the explicit, literal, revealed truth word by word, right? That kind of a fundamentalist Aristotelian interpretation or attempt to interpret the Bible, Old Testament or New, as that kind of a literal transmission of information, computer style, right, points to the absurdity. It's a total contradiction in terms. It points to the very absurdity of the approach in that case, because in fact what is being communicated by the very idea that's put out in the very first words of the Bible, that man is made in the living image of God, is precisely the process of concept formation, of creativity, which is totally contrary to any attempt to put any kind of transliteration or literal meaning on word-by-word analyses of the Bible, or anything else for that matter. All right? I mean, any actual concept, anything that actually communicates an idea, you cannot possibly communicate in that kind of literal way.
Well, if you compare them to the back manual, which were written about the same time.
As the Old or the New Testament? Where do you stand on this?
The Old Testament.
The Old Testament.
I'm a traditionalist.
Okay. Okay. In fact, there's some people who include the first Vax manuals as one of the Gnostic books of the Old Testament. So, but be careful. You don't want to fall into Gnosticism on this, right? So, all right. Now, see what's interesting here. Let's take a brief parenthesis. Why is it funny? I mean, that was pretty funny. It wasn't one of your world's most stellar jokes. It's not, I mean, it's nothing like... Why? Why? What's the irony? What did he say that was funny?
Well, it was a metaphor.
Yeah. It was a metaphor. It was negentropic, and it was Leibnizian. Okay, right. And it was undoubtedly Platonic and anti-Aristotelian. Okay.
It was isotropic.
Well, that's the way fundamentalists look at the Bible, the way.
Yeah.
That's why it's ironic.
Yeah, but what was funny about what John said? What was... Point to the part that was funny.
Because
He didn't say the computer is slow.
Yeah, but that's the metaphor.
Ah, exactly. There's nothing that he said that's funny. As usual. As usual.
Which is why My dentist is giving a class.
What was funny was the fact that he was the one that said it.
Yeah.
No, that made it funnier. But no, nothing that he said is funny. It's what he didn't say. It's what he left unsaid. It's the completed portion of the phrase that he left to every individual mind here to complete. That's what was funny. It's exactly what was not said. It's the unstated part. What he said was a literal statement, which juxtaposed in an ironic fashion two things. And he's implicitly saying that what's the implicit point? You can see how if you dissect the joke, it becomes extremely unfunny. What was he saying? I mean, and if you do this to one of Fernando Quijano's jokes, you'll probably cause a thermonuclear reaction. In the case of John's, it's merely boring. But if you just, okay, what was funny? Well, he said that he made a parallel between the Vax manual and the Old Testament of the Bible, right? That people read the thing the same. What's the implicit point? What's he saying? Well, that the Vax manual is extremely old, right? What does that imply? Well, that implies that it's extremely old because the Vax is extremely old. And he's talking to a group of people who have had the unpleasant experience of sitting around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for it to do anything. Blink at you, finally say, "I'm dying." Right? Anything, just speak to me. Right? Nothing. Okay? Now, if he had said that in a room of people who had never seen a Vax or never used a Vax, someone who was born in the last 20 years, for instance. Well, almost, sorry. It wouldn't be funny. Anyone who didn't know what a Vax was, it wouldn't be funny. So he was depending on some prior knowledge of a different subject to establish a parallel, a metaphor in your mind of two things, neither of which is funny. The Vax is particularly unfunny. But the comparison of the two, which he forces you, the listener, to make, is what introduces the element of humor. And that's what a joke is. That's what a pun is, also in particular, a play on words, right? A pun, right?
I don't know about that.
But you see, when you describe a joke, when you dissect it, when you say, okay, let's find the funny part, it's all of a sudden not particularly funny anymore, right? It's like saying, well, let's dissect this human being to find exactly what makes him live. You kill it if you slice it too thin. Right? And that's how it works, and that's what humor is. That's exactly how humor works. Exactly that kind of thing. And good jokes, the premise of a good joke, like any good bit of poetry, is to trigger in the mind of the person listening a creative flash of insight, which is humorous in the generation of that unstated part of the joke. The stated part is never funny. It's the in-betweenness. Nothing that John Heffel says is funny. I think we can safely conclude that that's the first lesson learned in tonight's class. You don't disagree, do you?
No, not at all.
Yeah. See? Okay. Now, anything else on Plato or anything else for that matter before we proceed on Aristotle?
You'll get no more jokes.
Okay. All right. The key concept in Aristotle, especially in terms of what we've been discussing about Plato, where he's talking about the intelligibility of the creative process, Aristotle's key point is that there isn't a creative process, and were there one, it would be unintelligible. He's opposed to the idea that any creative process is actually intelligible to the human mind. It may happen by pure good luck or by happenstance, but it is not something which is intelligible, knowable, and therefore reproducible. It doesn't exist. Now, where I like to start the discussion of Aristotle, and this is actually, in my view, not a bad place to start in the discussion of anything, is let's talk about what sort of a person he was. We'll get to his philosophy in a minute, but I think the best way to understand what his philosophy is let's talk about Aristotle the person. What kind of a person was he? Well, first of all, he was a coward. Right? He was an absolute coward. Secondly, he was affected. He had affectations. He wanted to act the role, to act a certain part. And I'm going to read you from Aristotle himself to demonstrate this. And third, he was an absolute Philistine. He had no belief whatsoever in the importance of ideas or anything like that. He had a completely Philistine, puerile view of man's mind, starting from his own mind. Now, okay, the cowardice side. This part I really kind of like, for reasons which you'll understand shortly. He was born in 374 BC. At the age of 18, in 366 BC, he joined Plato's academy at Athens. And he stayed there for 18 years, from 18 till 36. In the year 348, he leaves Plato's academy to go to tutor Alexander the Great. And in 334, he sets up his own lyceum, which is a counter to Plato's academy. Having studied there, having been a student of Plato's academy, he then sets up his own lyceum in 334. And then in 323, which is 11 years later, a very interesting thing happens. Everybody knows, of course, what happened to Socrates, because Plato recounts this in numerous of his dialogues. You all know, of course, that he was accused of impiety by the Athenian authorities for poisoning the minds of youth by teaching them things which challenged the religious views of the day, supposedly, and their piety and their understanding of the world. And Socrates was encouraged to recant, to back off from his ideas and beliefs, and to simply state that he didn't really mean it, or he had a different idea in mind. He basically was offered a plea bargain. And as everybody knows, Socrates said, no, there's nothing more important than the truth. It's something that I'll die for if I need to. My life is not a big deal. The truth is everything. And pretty much all of his disciples tried to convince him that that was very silly. Why didn't he just, cut a deal? It's no big deal. You can continue working on your philosophy. You're too important. You shouldn't allow this to happen. It's not worth it. You have a lot to do with your life still. Cut a deal. The basic line that's been put out many times, both before and after. I mean, this is also the basic thing that was told to Jesus Christ, right? Just cut a deal and, relax. What's all this Christianity nonsense? Just, you're too important. You can get back to doing other things. There's absolutely no reason to die on the cross. And basically, Socrates was offered a deal, and Socrates said no. He voluntarily chose his own death penalty in defense of the truth, because he thought that the truth was more important. So that's what happened with Socrates. Now, in 323, ironically enough, one of the beautiful ironies of history, Aristotle was also accused of impiety, right? Of being impious, impiedad. Right? And what Aristotle said is the following. They told him he had to shut the Lyceum and leave because he was spreading impiety. And he said that he did not want to, and he would not give Athens a second chance to sin against philosophy. And therefore he left. Meaning the first time Athens sinned against philosophy by allowing Socrates to be killed, and he, Aristotle, would not allow the Athenian population to sin against by killing him. And therefore, he said, I'm out of here. That's Aristotle. And he went home, and he lived with his mother, and he died the next year. That's the story of Aristotle. So if you want to know how important his ideas and his philosophy is to him, it's just that important. Just that important. When he was told, where do you stand? He said, hey, I'm out of here. See you later. I'm gone. Philosophy? Oh, I wouldn't want Athens to sin twice. Oh, no, no. Philosophy is so important for me that I'm going to save my skin. So, as you can see, this is a story that I consider to be very important. I think you get to find out a lot about the character of people under these kinds of circumstances. It's like all the deals that were offered to Lynn and the rest of us and so on and so forth. And Lynn, needless to say, did as Socrates, never as Aristotle. And this has a lot to do. You have a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. Does the strength come from the philosophy, or is the strength of the philosophy that it is this type of life, that is this type of belief in the importance of ideas? The two, in any event, go very close together. So Aristotle went home, lived with mom, and died the next year, 322. Now, so much for the cowardice. On his affectation, Aristotle has in the Nicomachean Ethics a description of what he calls the proud man, which is very revealing, aristocratic pride. And he says this in a favorable light, proud in the sense of you should be proud of this. And it gives you an idea of the kind of person he clearly thinks that he is or would like to be. And in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says the following. He says, "The proud man does not expose himself to trifling dangers." We found out that for sure. He does not expose himself to trifling dangers, nor is he fond of running risks at all, since there are few things that he values highly enough to make the risk worth a while. Great dangers, however, he is willing to face, and when he does so, he is unsparing of his life, knowing that it is not worth keeping at the cost of honor. Interesting. And then he says, "The proud man will, of course, be open in his hatreds and friendships, for concealment in these respects is cowardly. Caring more for truth than reputation, he is frank in word and deed, for his very disdain leads him to speak boldly. Consequently, he is truthful, except so far as he speaks with light irony, an attitude that he will adopt in dealing with the masses. Again, he is no gossip. He will not chatter about either himself or others, since it is no concern of his to receive compliments or to bestow either compliments or blame. He speaks no evil of others unless by way of deliberate insult to an enemy. Finally, the character of the proud man would seem to require that his gait should be slow. Gait means que camina despacio. That his gait should be slow, his voice low-pitched, and his diction measured. For a man is not likely to be in a hurry if he takes few things seriously, nor vehement if he considers nothing important. Excessive concern is what produces a shrill voice and a rapid gait." So much then for our account of the aristocratically proud man. That is Aristotle, affected. What's that?
Like the British?
Yes, it sounds very British, exactly. Exactly. A slow gait, speaking in profound tones, not hurried about anything, with disdain for the masses, right? Above it all. Who's then such a coward that he runs away when the truth is on the line. Okay, now that's in terms of his pride. Now, on the question of him being a Philistine, this takes us really more into the heart of his philosophy and what the truth is and how to know it, which is one of the subjects dealt with in the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, again, please keep in mind at every point, and if you don't recall, ask what Plato's view is on the same subjects that we're taking up here, because it's the comparison of the two that I'm trying to get at for you to recall. Now, the first thing he says about the truth is that it's only approximate. There is no such thing as the truth. Seeking the truth is a mistake. We must be content with a rough approximation to the truth. For when we are dealing with and starting out from what holds good only as a general rule, the conclusions that we reach will have the same character. Let each of the views put forward be accepted in the spirit, for it is the mark of an educated mind to seek only so much exactness in each type of inquiry as may be allowed by the nature of the subject matter. In other words, you can't really find out the truth. You can only get an approximation, so don't push it too hard. Then he says very emphatically that you really should never ask the question why. That's a very bad question to ask. You don't want to look at things that way, because there aren't going to be answers to that question of why. And he quickly proceeds to a direct, explicit attack on Plato's concept of the forms, what's usually translated as the forms, but which we discussed also as ideas, which Lynn on some occasions has said is better translated as species, in the sense of Cantor's species, but which I think you can also think about usefully in a different translation, which I liked from this book by this character, or this translation by this character Wainwright, which was done in 1935, which is to think of a Platonic idea as an archetype. That's the translation he gives. It's like species, an archetype, un archetipo. An idea is not a thing, it's an archetype. And this is the way Wainwright puts the point in a footnote. He says the following. He says, the Greek word idea is customarily translated as idea, and the Platonic doctrine referred to as the doctrine of ideas or forms. Properly speaking, the Greek word idea does not mean what is usually connoted by our word idea. It means, 1, the look or appearance of a thing, the immediate object of seeing, and 2, a nature, kind, or sort. In Plato's writings, the word carries both sets of connotations. It is the essential character belonging to a given class of objects. I'll repeat that. It is the essential character belonging to a given class of objects, directly apprehensible by the spiritual vision as something distinct from the particulars that participate in it. The English word archetype seems best suited to convey this total meaning. Okay? So Plato's forms or ideas, as I said last time, are not these abstract concepts floating around in the world of ideals above the individual objects which they somehow participate in, where chairs participate in chairness and blue participates in blueness and so on. That is not what Plato is talking about. Rather, it is this essential character belonging to a class of objects, and it is a character which is apprehensible directly only to spiritual vision, right? Meaning the mind, the active hypothesis-forming capability of the mind to reason. That's idea or archetype. And this is worth emphasizing because this is what Aristotle goes at with a sledgehammer. Now, this is very much what Cantor means by the use of the word manifold or aggregate. And I just want to reference this parallel here because we will get back to Cantor down the line a little bit later in the class series. But it's really useful keeping this in mind on the Plato question. Cantor, in his the Grundlagen, the Foundations of a General Theory of Manifolds, of 1883, in one of the footnotes, says something very interesting. You'll, of course, have read Lynn talking repeatedly about Cantor being firmly grounded in Plato, that his whole outlook is Platonic, and so on. Let's listen to Cantor himself in a footnote to the Grundlagen. He says, by a manifold or aggregate, I generally understand every multiplicity which can be thought of as one, i.e. any totality of definite elements which by means of a law can be bound up into a whole. And I believe that in this I am defining something which is related to the Platonic idea, as well as to that which Plato in his dialogue, Philebus, or the highest good, calls mikton. Plato counterposes this to the apeiron, i.e. the unlimited, indeterminate, which I call the non-genuine infinite, as well as to the peros, i.e. the limit, and explains it as an ordered mixture of the two latter. Plato himself indicates that these concepts are of Pythagorean origin. And then in another footnote later on, he says, Plato's conception of the infinite is an entirely different one than that of Aristotle. Similarly, I find points of contact for my conceptions in the philosophy of Nicolaus Cusanus. So that's Cantor talking about himself and his concept of the infinite, that he shares a view with Plato, not Aristotle, and Cusa. Okay, so, but did you get that part at the beginning? That was the key thing that I wanted to get across with this archetype or manifold idea, or the Greek idea thing. Any totality of definite elements, a multiplicity, which by means of a law can be bound up into a whole. That's what Cantor is talking about. And Plato. Now, last time we gave a few examples of this kind of thing. It's useful to have some specific examples in mind so that it doesn't become too abstruse. And the simplest forms of aggregates or sets or manifolds that we gave a couple of examples last time was this one, the integers. And I asked you for, if this is a multiplicity, it's the many, what is the single concept, the law or rule, if you will, the one, the single concept, which generates this multiplicity, right? And we agreed that it was the concept plus 1, right? And similarly with this, and so on and so forth, x squared. And we gave a number of examples of the sort. And we discussed the idea, there was a certain amount of back and forth on this, that a similar type of unified concept, a similar one, capable of generating many manys, was the idea of justice or beauty. Right? Or today we could add to that concept, that idea of a concept, the idea of humor or a joke. Right? It brings to mind, it generates in your mind an idea which is not specifically tied to any one particular joke. Right? But the idea of humor, it's also not some abstract category floating around, you know, a foot and a half above all individual jokes. Right? That's not what Plato means. Okay? But the concept, the mental object, the thought object, joke or humor, generates, it's a one, it's a unified one, which generates in the mind an ordered multiplicity, and a manifold, an aggregate, all of whose members of that aggregate or of that set share something in common. And that is the idea humor, the concept humor. So this idea, this concept of the one and the many is elaborated fairly explicitly, as you see in this Cantor quote that I read. And I think that this use of the idea archetype is actually a useful one. I don't want to try to pin any one word or any one translation down because I don't know Greek, and I'm sure that has enormous inadequacies. But I found it useful, at least in triggering in my mind the mental process that is useful to come to an understanding of this concept. So maybe it will for you as well. Okay, in the face of this, yeah, Jim?
Didn't Jung and some of the German philosophers use the word archetype quite a lot too?
No doubt. No doubt, but with a completely different sense and a completely different meaning. The way we should use it is we should try to use, I mean, that's the problem with any word or any translation that you choose. You're going to generally bring with it a whole lot of baggage from previous usages and forms of thinking that you've learned. And that's the difficulty with anything like this. If you use the word idea, or even if you use the word manifold or aggregate or something like that, you're going to run into that same type of problem. So you've got to try to separate out previous Aristotelian uses of this that you might have run across with a non-Aristotelian idea which we're trying to generate. Okay? Yeah?
How does geometry help organize the mind? Because, you know, when you build a solid, and then you build another more complex solid, isn't that just the same thing as, you know, figuring out what the next number is on the line? I mean, as opposed to using geometry to, you know, for metaphorical purposes.
Well, I mean, there's many points to this. I mean, one is that it gives you a very good sense of the way physical space-time is organized. All right? Why are there only 5 regular Platonic solids?
It's the metaphor that you want to.
Yes, I mean, sure, the idea is not to learn geometric formulas. I mean, the idea of working with geometry is not to become a great geometrician, per se. The idea of geometry is that it teaches your mind to think in the proper fashion. It educates your mind to think in the proper fashion. Same thing with music. The purpose of this isn't entertainment or knowledge in abstract. The purpose is to use this ability to think in the proper fashion to accomplish the job, the tasks that need to be accomplished. Our interest in studying geometry is not to become great geometers. Our interest in studying geometry is to figure out exactly what the proper shape is of the jail cell that we're going to put Henry Kissinger in. That's the kind of thing that you want to think about. All right? You know, Lynn has always proposed the idea of putting him in a very, very deep pit, deep underground. You know, since we're opposed to the death penalty, and eventually even Kissinger could conceivably find redemption. You know, preferably way, way down. That's the best place he should look for redemption. And then all of the widows and the orphans of the world who are the product of Kissinger's policies and of Kissinger's masters can come by and leave their due respects for him from any of their bodily functions that they care to execute on the spot. That was Lynn's proposal of the best way to handle the Kissinger question. So this is, and I'm cleaning it up. So that's one very useful way to think of geometry. But kidding aside, it raises questions. It helps you to think about the way in which the world, the universe functions. What is the nature of the way the world functions? Why should there be 5 and only 5 Platonic solids? Well, you learn a lot about why that's the case by actually going about the process of constructing them. If you actually try to build the 6th one, right, and you take triangles, for example, and you say, okay, there's got to be another way to put them together, you will rapidly discover as you try to do it with cardboard or whatever, that there is no way that the physical geometry of existing physical space-time can hold it. It doesn't work. You've got too many. Same thing when you take squares. After you've done your thing with squares, that's it. You can't do any more. All right, or the pentagons and so on and so forth. So what you're doing in the process is that you're discovering an underlying principle of the way physical space-time is actually organized through the process of engaging in these constructions, these geometric constructions. Because that becomes a very interesting question. And then you're on to the question of why is it organized along the lines of the golden proportion, the golden mean. So, okay, let me proceed. I know you're all trying to avoid Aristotle. That's very good. But as all clinicians, we must study the disease in order to recognize it wherever we see it. So, okay, so in the face of this idea of the concept of a unitary idea, a one, which explains the causality of the multiplicity, where it comes from, Aristotle says that the one, the idea of the good in particular, does not exist. And he attacks Plato directly on this. And he says it in this way. He does everything other than mention Plato by name. But it's quite clear. He says, those who have introduced the theory of forms or ideas are friends. Thank you very much. Nevertheless, I'm going to read this whole page. It's not that long, but it'll give you the basic Aristotelian idea. Those who have introduced the theory of forms are friends. Nevertheless, it would appear to be the better course, and indeed the only right one, if we lay claim to the title of philosophers, to sacrifice in the interests of truth even what lies closest to us. Both are dear, meaning the friends and truth. But it is a sacred duty to put truth first. And that's his justification of the attack he's now going to launch on Plato. He says, those who have supplied us with a theory of forms, i.e. Plato, did not themselves postulate archetypes for classes whose members they described as prior and posterior to one another. And for this reason, they did not provide for an archetype of numbers. The term good, however, is predicated alike in the categories of substance, of quality, and of relation. And of these, substance, being absolute, is prior by nature to what is merely relative, this being an offshoot or logical accident of substance. Consequently, there can be, on their own showing, no common archetype of good. Okay? Couldn't be clearer. No common archetype or idea of good. Point 2. Again, the term good is used in as many different senses as we use the verb is. Now he's saying, what do you mean by good? Right? Oh, it's used in many different ways, in as many different senses as we use the verb is. It's like, when you tell someone, don't do that, that's immoral. He's in the process of stabbing somebody or whatever, lighting fire to a subway train, and you say, don't do that, that's immoral. And he says to you, what do you mean by immoral? Define the word first. Right? That's what Aristotle is doing here. He says, again, the term good is used in as many different senses as we use the verb is. What do you mean by good? We apply it as predicate in the category of substance, as when we say that God and reason are good. In the category of quality, as applied to the virtues, of quantity, as applied to the moderate and due amount, of relation, as applied to what is useful, of time, as applied to what is opportune, of place, as applied to an abode, and so on. Clearly, then, says Aristotle, the good cannot be something at once universally present in all cases and single. In other words, it can't be one, it can't be single, and universally present in all places. Change for the word good, take one O out of the word, right? And you got the exact same argument on God. And then he says, it could be so only if it were applied as predicate, not in all the categories, but in a single one only. In other words, if you want it to be one thing, it can only apply in one case, because if it applies in many different cases, hey, it's many different things. Plato had already solved this problem a long time ago, but look at what Aristotle is doing. He says again, as there is a single science for all the things that fall under any one form, there would have to be a single science of all types of good. Okay? He said, now there's many goods, and so therefore we would have to have a single science for all types of good. As a matter of fact, however, there are many sciences, even of the goods that fall under one category. What is opportune, for example, in war is a question of strategy, in disease of medicine, and what is the due amount in the matter of food is a question of medicine, but in the matter of exercise, it's a question of gymnastic. Okay? So what he's saying is the good applies in different ways to different things. You cannot come up with a single unifying concept. Don't try. So what he's done is he's taken a single unified idea, and like a sausage, he sliced it into a million pieces. And after doing that, he says, you see, this slice is different from this slice. That's when Lynn talks about Aristotelian logic chopping. You've just seen it right there. Many goods all over the place and can't be compared. Okay. Since there are many different goods, and there's no unifying concept of the good, of one good, man is incapable of knowing it. This is not attainable by man. He says the following. He says, but as a matter of fact, the meanings of honor, of wisdom, and of pleasure are different even in respect of their goodness. Hence it follows that good is not some element common to all of these several things and implying a single archetype. For the same reason, we may dismiss the question of an archetype altogether. For even if we grant that there is a unitary good which is possessed in common by all good things, while at the same time it is separable from them and capable of an independent existence, clearly it will not be anything that man can attain to or realize in action. And this is the sort of good we are now seeking. So he's just said, well, even if you could come up with the idea that maybe there is some unitary good, forget it. Man cannot achieve it. It cannot be attained by man. And then, in a display of absolute philosophical brilliance, he says, and even if you could attain it, it ain't useful. So why bother? He says, finally, it is hard to see just how a knowledge of this good in itself is going to help a weaver or carpenter in the practice of his craft, or how anyone, by contemplating the pure archetype, will thereby become a better physician or a better general. This is evidently not the way in which a physician studies health. He studies the health of man, or rather of some particular man, for it is individuals that he has to cure. So much then for the theories of the Platonists. Now, this is what I mean by Philistine. This is pure Philistinism. Say, well, what's the use of a big fancy word like that? I mean, the good, come on, is it going to help me be a better doctor? No. I have to be a doctor for specific men, and for a man in particular. How is it going to help a carpenter? This is the jerk you run into on the street who says, oh yeah, sure, all these fancy ideas, but that's not going to help me get a better job. That's not going to help me be a better carpenter, a better weaver. What's in it for me? Explain to me the connection between all these highfalutin ideas of LaRouche and what I need to know now. All right? How am I going to get more food on my table? You can't explain that to me? Well, what good are your ideas? Don't tell me about physical economy. Yeah, talk to me in a language I can understand. Well, buddy, you don't speak a language that is human. So, of course I can't make you understand in that language. You have to learn a new language. So, Aristotelian absolute Philistinism. So much then for the theories of the Platonists, he says, in dispelling it. Now, in terms of the epistemology, he then goes on to say, look, the problem here in any event is that everything changes, but in changing, you can't know it. He rejects the idea of change. He says the only thing that you can know are those things that are static, things that do not change. That's the real subject of science, is that which does not change. Compare this to Plato. Right? Says, the nature of scientific understanding, using the word in its strict sense, and not as when its meaning is extended by analogy, may be explained as follows. In the first place, we all take for granted that what we know scientifically is something that fundamentally cannot vary. Since in the case of things that can vary, once they have passed beyond the range of our observation, we cannot know whether they exist or not. The objects of scientific understanding must therefore have the character of necessity. This means that they are eternal. That is to say, they don't change. Right? And that's the only thing that you can know anything about. Anything that changes, you know nothing. Of course, Plato and Heraclitus have already demonstrated that all reality is nothing but change. Right? And then Aristotle goes on to say that, therefore, the only way you can know anything is you know the particular specific thing, and then you can proceed by building blocks to a concept of something larger, and maybe eventually, if you add enough building blocks or bricks, you can get to a universal idea. And that experience is the source of all actual real knowledge. Experience, personal experience, perception. And he says it as follows. The first principles of philosophy and natural science are built up from experience. And then he says, and this is, he says, talks about the same matter in De Anima. There's a very good quote on this, which I'll read you. He says, mistakes occur when you start to try to connect things. Right? Error is introduced when you try to look at a bigger picture, when you try to form a hypothesis. Truth is found in perceptions. Synthesis is where error is introduced, says Aristotle. And he says the following, the thinking then of indivisibles, meaning very specific little minute things, the atoms of reality, specific things, the thinking then of indivisibles is to be counted among those things with which falsity has no connection. In things, however, to which falsity and truth apply, there is already some synthesis of thoughts, which are treated as though they were one. Things are first separate and then conjoined. Okay? First separate and then conjoined. Right? Reality is made up of this atom, and this atom, and this atom, and that atom, and this atom, and they're like building blocks. It's bricks. And the only thing you can really know at all is your experience of this particular atom. And when you start trying to connect them, that's synthesis, and that's where you introduce errors. That's a good strict definition of Aristotelianism. So only perceptions are true, not any ideas, not the mental process that tries to connect them. That's where you begin to get errors. Now, where does this basic epistemology lead Aristotle in terms of his thinking on matters such as morality and the existence of the soul, God, and so on and so forth? What's his moral outlook? Where does such an epistemology lead you to in moral outlook? I think you can make a pretty good educated guess. But let's follow Aristotle's logic on this. The irony of this book is the title, De Anima, on the soul, because it's a book on the soul in which he demonstrates, or tries to demonstrate, argues that the soul doesn't exist, which is one reason why it's a little bit ironic and humorous for any Christian to say that he is simultaneously an Aristotelian. Because the fundamental argument in Aristotle is that the world is such that the soul does not exist. So what sort of a Christian outlook is this that posits Aristotelianism? That is to say, that argues that a soul does not exist. Now, let's listen to what he has to say on this. First of all, he says, look, he takes up the issue of Plato directly on the issue of the one and the many, and Plato's concept of the soul. Plato equates the soul with mind, with thought, that thinking process, that creative process, which is what is man's soul. And Plato attacks him. He says the following: Plato is clearly wanting his world soul to be of the same kind as that which is ordinarily called the intellect. But the intellect, says Aristotle, is a single and continuous thing, as is thinking. And thinking just consists of thoughts. Interesting. Press the red button where you think that a little bit of cheating is going on. You all have a red buzzer in front of you. Press your red buzzer. Right? That's an interesting sentence, right? But the intellect is a single and continuous thing, as thinking. And thinking just consists of thoughts. Now, is that true? Yeah.
I thought you weren't allowed to connect thoughts in your thinking.
Aha. Aha. How is it possible? Well, he's going to say just that. If thinking is made up of thoughts, like the blocks there, right, the atoms, how can you have a process of thinking? He says, you can't, exactly. He says, but these are one only by being in sequence. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4 in sequence, as in the case with numbers. Exactly what you just said. And not in the way that a quantity is one thing. Thus, it cannot be in this latter way that the mind is continuous. Rather, it must either be without parts or continuous, but not in the way that a quantity is. That's interesting. For it to be continuous, it either has to be without parts. In other words, if it's going to be one, it can't also be many. Right? That's what he's saying. And if it has many, well, then it can't be one. In any case, how is it to think if it is a quantity? Perhaps we would say that it is by each of its own parts. Right? So each part does the thinking. So you chop the brain into pieces. And each thinks in its own parts. But will it have parts in the quantitative sense or only as points? To assume that we can talk about parts in the latter sense. But if it is with the parts in the sense of points, and if there is an infinity of these, then the mind will never complete its thought. That's true enough from his standpoint. If it's an infinity of points, and if it's chopped up like sausage, and if thinking is nothing but the individual thoughts, then what connects them? It will never complete the thought. And then he says, there is a further puzzle as to how, if the mind is without parts, it will think that which has parts, and vice versa. So he's really completely at a loss to have any sort of explanation of the idea of the one and the many. And if you start from the many, if you start from the parts, in effect, you cannot justifiably come to a summation of the parts, which is the one. Therefore, the mind doesn't exist. Thinking doesn't exist. You can never complete a thought. You've all obviously talked to people like that. Right? They never quite, they'll say 17 different things. They interrupt themselves. They go off in another direction. They never complete a thought. It's really disorienting to try to talk to that person. That's what Aristotle is saying, the way the mind works generally. Then he says, okay, if that's the way the mind is, there is no mind, there is no soul. So the question is, what do we do to get people to do the right thing? What's right, what's wrong? He says, well, the best way to do this is let's just use hedonism. Let's use pleasure and pain. right? It's a reality. Let's make use of it. And he says the following. This is back in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says, again, a love of pleasure has been fostered in all of us from infancy, and thus has become so thoroughly ingrained in our lives that it can hardly be eradicated. And even in the judging of actions, we all of us tend to a greater or lesser degree to make pleasure and pain our standard. The whole subject, both of moral virtue and of statecraft, is bound up with the question of pleasures and pains. For if a man employs these well, he will be good, if badly, bad. Now that's interesting. The only basis of morality, or ethics as he calls it, is the proper application of pleasure and pain. There is no higher principle. Well, of course there's no higher principle. He's just told you there's no mind, there's no soul, you can't finish a thought, there's no one, there's no archetype, there's no idea, there's no God. Well, of course there's no morality. Excuse me?
There is no good.
There's definitely no good. There's many specific attributes of good that different good things have, but you can't come up with a universal concept of it. He already said that. So of course, if you want to develop an ethic, you have to say, well, let's use pleasure and pain. And the only thing that makes things good or bad is if you properly apply hedonism, pleasure and pain, or improperly apply it. Sort of like electroshock. You know, this is Pavlov's dog. Someone does the right thing, who decides what's right? If there is no absolute question of what's right, then who decides? Right? Whatever is right, well, you give him the doggy biscuit and he'll salivate. Right? And people are like that. Right? And if not, then you torture him. You electrocute him, or you induce pain somehow. Pleasure and pain. This is the whole behaviorist school of psychology, which, psychiatry and psychology, which of course I'm sure you won't be surprised to know was developed at Harvard by B.F. Skinner and other psychologists, who demonstrated and proved something which is in fact true, which is that the laws that apply to the behavior of Pavlov's dog, right? You all know the experiment of Pavlov's dog? You've heard of it? Pavlov's dog, this is a Russian so-called scientist, behaviorist, sort of an animal trainer, a glorified animal trainer, who passed himself off as some sort of big psychologist. And what he demonstrated is that you could induce behavior that you were trying to induce in an animal by presenting a stimulus and getting a response. And every time the stimulus is present, you'll get the response. For example, every time you feed the dog, you bring him food and you flash on a red light or a green light, let's say a green light. And you bring him food and of course he starts salivating. And you do that 10 times so that the dog gets in his mind the association, the correlation between the green light, the food, and of course he starts salivating. And then the next time what you do is you don't bring him the food, but you just turn on the green light. And Pavlov's dog starts salivating. Brilliant, isn't it? Okay, well that's it. That's behaviorism. And there's a big debate in behaviorism over whether you can do the same thing with negative punishment and positive reward, a mixture of both, and so on. This is OBE, by the way. This is exactly what the whole school system idea is. You reward people for doing the right thing, for showing the right behavior. What's important is behavior, not thinking, but behavior, your expressed affectations, like Aristotle. And you reward them if they do it right, and you punish them if you do it wrong. B.F. Skinner did a whole bunch of experiments with pigeons, basically, in which he, gave electroshock to these animals, did all sorts of things, and got them to respond a certain way. They would peck at certain keys, and he did all of this sort of stuff. And then he, of course, made the great leap to say, well, this is obviously the way the human mind works too. And it is certainly the case that you can, through behaviorism and attendance at Harvard, reduce the human mind to the level of a pigeon. There's no question. That you can do. You can make of human beings virtual pigeons. That you can do. But that's not what makes him a human being. You never can make a pigeon into a human being. You can't make B.F. Skinner into a human being. You can make B.F. Skinner into a pigeon. And the behaviorists and the pigeons, they share a lot in common. But that's the form of argument. That's behaviorism. That's what Aristotle is saying. you've got to use pleasure and pain to induce people to do what's, quote, good and bad. Yeah.
Tengo un comentario sobre eso de comparar. Ayer pasó un programa de televisión anoche que se llama Top with Animals. Y lo que estaban haciendo es que estaban comparando a los chimpancés con los niños. Y ponían a los chimpancés a hacer cosas, por ejemplo, agarrar una galleta. Y ponían dos cosas, una donde se podía agarrarla y otra donde se caía la galleta. Y el chimpancé agarraba donde no se caía la galleta. Y después ponían a los niños a que hicieran lo mismo y los niños agarraban la parte donde se caía la galleta. Entonces el comentario que dijo que los chimpancés son más inteligentes que los niños.
Yeah, she's saying she saw a TV program on chimpanzees and children, drawing the parallels, saying that basically children and chimpanzees are the same thing, only that the chimpanzees are actually smarter, because they set up a situation where there was a cookie there for the chimpanzee to grab and the kid to grab, but if you did it the wrong way, it would fall down and so on. And the chimpanzees always figured out how to not have the cookie fall down, but the kids didn't. So this was not only comparing chimpanzees with children, but actually saying that the chimpanzees are smarter. But that's the bestial concept of man, is this behaviorist type of thing, which is what Aristotle is saying here. Now, on this question of hedonism, okay, on this question of using pleasure and pain, then further in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says the following. Well, he says, in educating the young, we use pleasure and pain as rudders to steer their course, right, to orient their course. Now, if that's your view of where ethics come from, then, of course, with Aristotle, you will reach the conclusion, as he does, that virtue is the middle ground between different options, none of which is absolutely good. And you must choose, and this is where the phrase comes from, the lesser of two evils. You ever heard that expression? Oh, I got to vote for this guy. He's the lesser of two evils. All right? Well, who are you going to kill today? Your mother or your third cousin? Well, I think I'll kill my third cousin. It's the lesser of two evils. All right? That's the concept of ethics or good in Aristotle, the lesser of two evils. And I'll read you the quote. I didn't know that this is where it had come from until I read this, but this is it. The Nicomachean Ethics. He says, we have now sufficiently shown that moral virtue consists in observance of a mean, a middle ground. And in what sense this is so? In the sense, namely, of holding a middle position between two vices, one of which involves excess and the other deficiency, and also in the sense of being the kind of a disposition which aims at the middle point both in feelings and in action. As it is hard to hit the exact mean, we ought to choose the lesser of the two evils. Okay? So whenever anyone comes to you with this lesser of two evils nonsense, you say it's Aristotle. That's where it is, Nicomachean Ethics. Now, obviously, if you have this view, you will also share Aristotle's argument that his attack on Plato on the idea that man is the crown of creation, that man is the jewel of God's creation, the highest point. Aristotle says, to argue that man is superior to the other animals is beside the point, for there are other things more divine in the universe even than man. For example, the celestial bodies, to name only the most conspicuous. So it's a very coherent package. Aristotle. Now, and you've been thinking about Plato all the time, right, to keep these two things in your mind. Two completely different, entirely contradictory, mutually exclusive worldviews. David Hume, British empiricist, head of British intelligence in the 18th century, teacher of Adam Smith, avowed Aristotelian, and as you can see, just a little bit effeminate. There's a whole school which develops in Britain in response to some of the major breakthroughs in continental science, especially coming out of Cusa and then in also response to Leibniz, which is a school known as British empiricism or philosophical radicalism. They're all worth reading from a clinical standpoint, the same way an oncologist has got to study cancer to know what's going on, but always from the standpoint of knowing what healthy tissue is. Some of the major British philosophers associated with this school, this Aristotelian school of empiricism, are, for example, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called Leviathan in 1651. I'm just sort of locating Hume for you in a general period, middle of the 17th century. Hobbes's view of man is basically that men are complete animals and they'll display their bestiality by destroying their fellow man if necessary to get what they want for themselves, to satisfy their own hedonistic impulses. And that the natural tendency of man is to act like a complete beast, to act like the typical character in a Hollywood movie, go only for his own interests, and therefore destroy everything around him if he feels that that will benefit him. And the only way, therefore, to establish the existence of a society that will function without violence of each against all is to establish a super control, a Leviathan, which he calls Leviathan, which is a kind of monster, a big state, a big government, a one-world government, which will control and restrain the destructive bestial instincts and impulses of individual hedonistic man. That's Hobbes. 40 years later, more or less, in 1690, John Locke writes his essay concerning human understanding, which shares the same basic outlook of total empiricism, of Aristotelianism. Following Locke, and I won't go into either of those, you can read them on your own if you like. It's interesting. It's very transparent. Once you've read Plato and know a little of Aristotle, these guys are completely transparent, as is Hume, as you'll see in a moment. Hume was born in 1711, died in 1776. It's not known if the Declaration of Independence is what killed him, but probably. There would be a certain lawfulness and coherence and justice to that. In 1748, he wrote one of his most famous works, if not his most famous work, called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which I'll come to in a minute. So he's in the middle of the 18th century. One of his prize students is Adam Smith. Hume, incidentally, is the head of British intelligence, the British Secret Service. That's one of the other things that he does. He develops his philosophy, supposedly, as part of this operation. Adam Smith is a student of his. Adam Smith is 1723 to 1790. And of course, Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, which is the British system polemic against American system economics. Having written previous to that in 1759 a study which Lynn quotes a lot called The Theory of the Moral Sentiments, where he lays out his view of morality, his view of man and morality, which is the premise from which he then elaborates an economic system premised on that idea of man. So Smith is following directly in the footsteps of Hume, and of course after Smith come people like Jeremy Bentham, who in 1789 writes The Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, which is the systematic statement of the hedonistic philosophy, what Bentham calls the philosophic calculus, in that man seeks his own felicity or happiness and avoids pain, and everything he does can be measured as a Newtonian calculation, a calculus of quantities of pleasure and pain, and man acts exclusively on that basis. Man is a little calculating machine, and that's Bentham's his whole theory. Now, on Hume, I'm not the only one I want to talk about a little bit. I want to read a little bit of Hume to you, just so that you'll get a strong odor of Aristotle. Okay. Either that, or you'll think someone here has an upset stomach. But some people may have an upset stomach. We can't rule that out. We're going to come to the question of experiments and causality in a minute. There may be, when you smell that strong odor, you can reach the conclusion that either someone or a number of us have upset stomachs, or you will say, aha, Aristotle, okay? Because the two smells are very similar. Now, Hume. What are Hume's key points? First, he says that the mind, the human mind, is nothing but a succession of perceptions. There is no one. There is no unified one. There's only manys. Point number two from Hume. This understanding, he says, of the world leads us to a fundamental skepticism. And he develops out a skeptical philosophy. Skeptical in the sense that if the only thing that you know are perceptions of individual things, then you cannot possibly establish any necessary connection between any two such perceptions. So there's no causality. A happens and B happens. But if all you know is the perception of A, there is nothing in that perception per se which can possibly force the existence of B. No causality. All you have is a correlation. No causality. And this leads to complete skepticism. Hume gets around this skepticism by positing, he brings in a little contraband to solve the problem in the Aristotelian tradition of Philistinism. And he says, well, maybe there's skepticism, but actually this is all settled by habit and custom. And he differs with Hobbes in particular in that the habit and custom which men have, which sort of brings everything together, is not only this bestiality and this horrible, violent sense of self, but Hume comes to argue there's a certain kind of natural selflessness in man. He feels favorable to his fellow man. Why? Well, it's habit. Yeah, but what's your evidence? Well, it's custom. Right? So there's a nuance of difference in specifics between Hume and Hobbes and Locke before him, but the basic form of the argument is exactly the same. Now, let's just walk through this argument briefly. And as you'll see, this is crucial to understanding liberal economics today. If you get this, you understand what's going on in the derivatives market. If you don't get this, you don't understand what's really behind that. Hume, in his Treatise of Human Nature, 1740, Book 4, Chapter 7, there's a little subhead, and it's called, conveniently enough, Of Personal Identity. It's a discussion of personal identity. What is the I? What is the sense of self? Where does it come from? And he says, well, self is nothing but a succession of impressions or perceptions that you have of yourself, and that is always changing. Therefore, there is no self. Okay, here's how he says it. Self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived. And consequently, there is no such idea. Okay, straightforward. This is the problem that we discussed way back when, a class or two ago, right? All you perceive are your perceptions of yourself, but since that changes constantly, there's nothing that unites it or holds it together, therefore there is no I, no sense of self. Well, lawfully, if you deny the existence of the self, you're of course going to deny the existence of the human soul. And he says, as for mankind, they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight. And all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change. Nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. The mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity. Okay? Ain't no I. Doesn't exist. So since there is no sense of identity, the only thing that you have are certain experienced relations, not causality, but existing perceived relations. Like that you can perceive the relation between, for example, the passage of a certain period of time when it's dark outside After that happens, you perceive a relationship between that to the sun coming up. But there's no explanation causally. All you have is a relationship. And the same thing in terms of identity. He says the following: our last resource is to yield to it and boldly assert that these different related objects are in effect the same, however interrupted and variable. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. Thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses to remove the interruption, and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise the variation. But we may farther observe that where we do not give rise to such a fiction, our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts beside their relation. This is an attack on religion, in case you didn't figure that out. All right? You imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts, but that doesn't really exist. The only thing that actually you have is a relationship. So consequently, of course, there is no such thing as cause and effect, only association. And he says, the understanding, the mind, never observes any real connection among objects, and that even the union of cause and effect, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. Right? There is no actual causal relationship. Okay, no identity, no self, no soul. Fine, 1740 Treatise of Human Nature. Then he says, I'm going to apply this entire method, which is straight Aristotle, as we just saw, and I'm going to apply that to the totality of reality, not only the individual, but the totality of reality. And 8 years later, out comes the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Head of British Intelligence, teacher of Smith. Keep that in mind. And he says, okay, what's the subject matter of our understanding? What do we look at when we apply our mind? He says, well, you look at two different kinds of things. On the one hand, you have relations of ideas, and on the other hand, you have matters of fact. The relations of ideas are thought alone. It's only mental activity. And fact and experience have nothing to do with it. For example, he says, mathematical formulas like the Pythagorean theorem. That's purely a relation of idea. Thinking the opposite of a relation of idea is impossible. It's true on the surface of it, such as mathematical formulas. Matters of fact, however, are questions of cause and effect, where the opposite is conceivable. It is possible. Like to say, for example, the sun will not rise tomorrow morning. Well, that's possible to conceive. And says Hume, it's merely a matter of fact. It's subject to verification. It's subject of observation. And he says, okay, let's look into this further, this question of matters of fact. He says, facts come entirely from experience of conjoined objects. Right? Objects that appear together in our appearance, in our perceptions of them. And experience is the only source of knowledge and information that we have. He says, when we discuss facts, we must inquire how we arrive at the knowledge of cause and effect. I shall venture to affirm, as a general proposition, which admits of no exception, that the knowledge of this relation is not, in any instance, attained by reasoning a priori, but arises entirely from experience when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. In other words, cause and effect, to say A causes B, is not a result of reason, but it comes only from seeing A and B associated together all the time. But there is no lawfully demonstrated connection. He says, let an object be presented to a man of ever so strong natural reason and abilities. If that object be entirely new to him, he will not be able, by the most accurate examination of its sensible qualities, to discover any of its causes or effects. Adam, though his rational faculties be supposed, at the very first entirely perfect, could not have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water that it would suffocate him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it would consume him. No object ever discovers by the qualities which appear to the senses either the causes which produced it or the effects which will arise from it. Nor can our reason, unassisted by experience, ever draw any inference concerning real existence in matters of fact. This proposition that causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience will readily be admitted. Okay? Right. No explanation. Don't try to find a hypothesis or an explanation. And there is a logic to this which is true. There's part of this which is true. If you start from the premise that what you know is the object in itself, the thing in itself, and that the smaller the object and the more you directly perceive it, the closer you are to truth, and if its reality is determined entirely within its own borders, then in effect, how can you say that this cause can have an effect on this? What is it that's doing the affecting? If this is entirely self-contained and this is entirely self-contained, how can one possibly affect the other? It's true. That's true. If you start by saying that A is entirely defined inside itself, how can it possibly affect B? Think of it in terms of people, in terms of an existentialist concept of a human being. I'm entirely defined within myself. I am who I am. I'm knowable only to me. No one affects me. No one will get to me. Well, how do you affect anybody else? It's the billiard ball theory of human relations, right? Bumping around. And if that's your premise, if that's your assumption, your axiom, then the rest follows logically. And it's true that you can generate no concept of cause and effect if you start from multiplicity, if you start from the many. Absolutely true. There is no cause and effect in the world of the many only. Now, he then goes on to say that only nature, everything we know about nature we know only from experience. He says all the laws of nature and all the operations of bodies without exception are known only by experience. Okay? That's pretty straightforward, categorical. The only thing we know about anything in nature is by experience alone. And therefore there's no connection of cause and effect. He says the mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination. For the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from the motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest the smallest hint of the other. Right? Two billiard balls that hit each other. If the reality of the one is totally self-contained, you cannot possibly explain it having an effect on any other billiard ball that's also totally self-contained. And of course, this worldview leads you, Hume says, to complete skepticism, because you can infer nothing whatsoever about the future. All you know is that it might have happened that way in the past, but there's no necessary causal relation for you to be able to say with certainty that it will happen in the future. He says, as to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information for those precise objects only. For those precise objects only, what you've seen in the past. And that precise period of time, which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know may be only in appearance similar, this is the main question on which I would insist. The consequence seems nowise necessary. At least it must be acknowledged that there is here a consequence drawn by the mind, that there is a certain step taken, a process of thought, and an inference which wants to be explained, which cannot be explained. Right? And this inference, this connection of A to B, of cause to effect, of object to object, is unjustified. And therefore, we know nothing. It is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future, since all of these arguments are founded on the supposition of that resemblance. So nothing can be proven, nothing can be said, you can know nothing. The only thing that you know, he says, is a probability of correlation. You don't know causality, all you know is a probability. Where have you heard this before? A probability of correlation. things have appeared together in the past many times. The more times they appear together, the more convinced you are that they will appear together again in the future.
Basis of every single derivatives treating model that's ever been created.
And any that might be created, by definition. So, he says, being determined by custom to transfer the past to the future in all our inferences, where the past has been entirely regular and uniform, we expect the event with the greatest assurance, and we leave no room for any contrary supposition. But where different effects have been found to follow from causes which are to appearance exactly similar, all these various effects must occur to the mind in transferring the past to the future, and enter into our consideration when we determine the probability of the event. Okay? Now, in other words, see, this is a really fundamental question here that we're starting to take a look at. Because what he's saying here is that the only certainty that you have of the consequences of something is not something that can be explained rationally or reasonably by the mind on the basis of a hypothesis. Oh, that causes this. No, no, no. All you can say is that in the past, event A has always been followed by event B. And I can't say that event A causes event B. I can say it's correlated to B. And the more times it's been correlated in the past, the greater my certainty. And knowledge is therefore not knowledge of cause and effect, it's knowledge of increasing probabilities. All you know is the likelihood that something will happen. And Bertrand Russell then picks this up. He says, how do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? We don't. We don't. We don't know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. What's the argument? Well, every day that I've been around here on this earth, it has. Well, that's pretty strong. But then let's look at all recorded history. Well, my grandfather and his grandfather, and going back as far as recorded history knows, the sun has always risen in the morning. Well, that's a stronger argument still. But does it prove it? Absolutely not. No cause and effect. It's happened a lot in the past. It'll probably happen again.
If it didn't rise, there wouldn't be a tomorrow.
But there's no explanation. There's no reason. All you have is probabilistic correlation. You know, it's the famous, Lynn used to tell this story. Maybe he still does. I haven't heard it lately. But the story of the empiricist, the follower of Hume and Aristotle, who jumps off the top floor of the Empire State Building. Right? This dates the Lynn story, because when he started telling this, there wasn't any World Trade Center, and the Empire State Building was the tallest building. But we'll keep.
What was that?
Long time ago. So he jumps off the Empire State Building, the empiricist. And as he passes the first 5 floors, he says, things are going pretty well. I've passed 5 floors. Nothing has happened. Passes it. You see what's going to happen? Passes another 5 floors. Hey, another 5 floors. The stronger correlations are being expressed. The probability looks good. And every floor he passes, the more and more and more convinced he is that this is perfect. And he is at the height of his conviction of Aristotelian certainty at the point where, splat. That's Aristotelianism. Exactly that. Or it's like the old scientific argument. You know, the guy who proved that cheese kills mice? Well, every time he put cheese in a mouse trap, the mouse died. Every single time. Total correlation, 100%. Cheese kills mice. Can you disprove it? Of course not. Highly strong correlation on this thing. And this is how experiments in science often work. You've seen this, right? This correlation business. You wanted to say something?
Well, it's saying that both of these examples prove, you know, to the Aristotelian that you can't prove that just because, you know, you keep passing floor after floor that you're not going to splat, you know, at the bottom of it. Isn't that what they were their contention?
Well, what they would say is that another factor came into play at the last minute, at the last floor, that you didn't have any evidence of previous to that. But the point is that they don't, you know, it's the, you know, a third factor that wasn't taken into account in your original equation, and therefore what you've got to do is in your next study of this, you've got to consider more factors and set up more control groups so that you isolate those factors. And this is the way a lot of modern medicine works, for example. It's strict correlation. What do? You set up a whole battery of tests. You have 3 million mice, and you're going to feed them large quantities of some supposed carcinogen to see if that carcinogen produces cancer, right? And what you do is you establish a correlation. In this group, they get that particular item. This group doesn't, and you see the results. And so you establish a highly sophisticated statistical correlation among the different variables. And you isolate certain variables and you control the rest. You have to have control groups and so on and so forth. Now, let me just say, these kinds of experimental techniques are absolutely necessary. You have to run experiments like that. You have to have control groups. If you want to know whether the cheese or the mousetrap killed the mice, you want to try to study the effect of each differentially, that is to say, separate them. To some of the mice, you give only cheese and no mousetrap. To the others, you give the mousetrap alone, and you try to find out which did. But the purpose of doing such experiments, to the thinking mind, to the Platonic scientist, is that it gives him raw material from which to develop a hypothesis, right? A basis, an educated basis on which to form a reason, a cause and effect, an explanation, to answer the question why. Not just that something happens. If you do A, you always get B. Why? 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 And until you can answer that question, you don't know what you're doing. You may be stuck with it. You may not have any other approach at that time. In certain aspects of medicine, for example, doctors absolutely don't know why certain things work. But they do know that certain medicine works. But until you know the reason, the causality, then you're nowhere. You don't really have an explanation of the thing. That doesn't mean that you don't use the medicine. There's certain, for example, antipsychotic drugs, which, when given to people, lithium and so on and so forth, they produce an effect. How and why? Nobody really knows. They just don't know. And all sorts of similar phenomena do occur. They don't know why it works, how it works. They know that it works, that's all. Similarly, in a lot of cancer research, the same type of thing. You get certain results, and a lot of the experimental work that's done is, just the most empiricist Aristotelian work imaginable. Well, we don't know if this is going to, let's just grab something off the shelf and try that, right? Let's try this and see what effect it has on this type of cancer. Well, it doesn't work. All right, let's try something else, right? And hopefully at some point that those experiments are guided by a certain informed knowledge of what might work and might not. But in many cases, it's purely correlational, totally correlational. And then if you discover that it does have an effect on the cancer, you say, well, let's see if it works with more or less. Well, let's see if it works combined with another drug, or not combined, or combined with this. It's totally blind, completely blind, because it does not approach the thing from the standpoint of discovering the causality, how it works, why things work, and to then figure out a solution for the thing, or to approach the experimental work with control groups and so on from that hypothesis-forming standpoint. So what you get is an entirely different approach to knowledge, where knowledge becomes simply the highest possible statistical correlation between unconnected facts. And the greater correlation you can establish in your mathematical function, that's truth. And that's what you get all over the place now, that type of thing. Now, returning to Hume on this thing, he says that after having said all of this and developed a total demonstration that no causality exists, that only skepticism is called for, he then turns around and says, well, you know what, I was really sort of kidding. He says, don't take this too seriously. It doesn't really work in the real world. This is just sort of a little philosophical exercise, sort of, intellectual masturbation. He says, nor need we fear that this philosophy, while it endeavors to limit our inquiries to common life, should ever undermine the reasonings of common life and carry its doubts so far as to destroy all action as well as speculation. Nature will always maintain her rights and prevail in the end over any abstract reasoning whatsoever. He's commenting about his own reasoning that he's just gone through. He says, don't worry about it. The fact of the matter is that what happens is, even though there is no demonstrable, scientifically knowable relation of cause and effect, nonetheless, custom and habit of humanity assert themselves. And that is the ultimate explanation of what ties together what is otherwise a completely divided and separated, sausage-like world made up of parts. He says, there is some other principle which determines man to form such a conclusion of a unified whole. This principle is custom or habit. For wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation, without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. By employing that word, we pretend not to have given the ultimate reason of such a propensity. We only point out a principle of human nature, which is universally acknowledged and which is well known by its effects. Perhaps we can push our enquiries no farther, or pretend to give the cause of this cause, but must rest contented with it as the ultimate principle which we can assign of all our conclusions from experience. All inferences from experience, therefore, are effects of custom, not of reasoning. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we should be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact beyond what is immediately present to the memory and senses. What is custom and habit? It's nothing. I mean, this is complete philosophical garbage. I mean, this is just complete dreck. It's Philistine, it's cheating, it's tramposo. It's not taking ideas seriously. It's developing out the logical consequences of starting from an Aristotelian standpoint, being uncomfortable with the conclusion, which is, well, this leads to total skepticism, and then saying, well, you know what? There's this thing called custom. What's that? Well, it's the way we usually pull ideas together. This guy's supposed to be a philosopher. He's supposed to be explaining how it works. Nah, it's custom and habit. Don't worry, it works. Trust me. And so what is he left with? He's left with the following conclusions, that ideas are nothing but, think of Plato, ideas for Hume and Aristotle are nothing but copies of perceptions. Right? And you develop the more complex from the more simple. He says, all our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions, or in other words, that it is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt either by our external or internal senses. How do you like that? It is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt either by our external or internal senses. What about Eratosthenes? How did he figure out that the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, and measure it? Did he feel it? Did he have sense it? Did he perceive it? Absolutely not. And this is hundreds and hundreds of years after Eratosthenes. Hume says, nah, if you don't perceive it, you can't think it. Therefore, creativity and will, human will, the decision to act, is beyond all comprehension. He says, but do we pretend to be acquainted with the nature of the human soul and the nature of an idea, or the aptitude of the one to produce the other? This is a real creation, a production of something out of nothing, which implies a power so great that it may seem at first sight beyond the reach of any being, less than infinite. At least it must be owned that such a power is not felt, nor known, nor even conceivable by the mind. We only feel the event, namely the existence of an idea, consequent to a command of the will. But the manner in which this operation is performed, the power by which it is produced, is entirely beyond our comprehension. Forget it. You can't understand creativity. Unintelligible. The unintelligibility of creativity, the exact opposite of what Plato says. And certainly, therefore, human will cannot be an effective cause in the world. It can't actually act. Liberty, which is where will comes from, human will, the belief in freedom or liberty, that you can act to do something or not to do it, is completely an illusion. And if you do not have liberty, of course, you don't have morality either, which is a nice, convenient conclusion which he was trying to get to. He says, by liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. He says, and if the definition above mentioned be admitted, liberty, when opposed to necessity, not to constraint, is the same thing with chance, which is universally allowed to have no existence. So there is no freedom. There is no will. Consequently, there's no morality. And therefore, God is completely unknowable. Unknowable scientifically, cannot be acceded to by reason, and any belief in God is pure dogma, as true or as false as the skeptical view which he presented before. Believe it if you want, don't believe it if you don't want, not scientific. This is a complete atheistic concept of the atheist who says, well, I believe in God too, why not? You can believe whatever you want. A non-scientific, unrigorous approach. Appropriate for the head of British intelligence. Now, in conclusion, let me just quickly bring this into the world of Adam Smith and economics. Hume's concept of habit, or custom, which is, after all, the contraband he brings into his philosophical system, his Aristotelian system, at a certain point where it's all about to splatter in a million directions, he says, no, 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 there's custom and habit, he brings it in, and that's what holds everything together. That's how people make decisions. That's where you get a unified approach. This is the exact equivalent, and probably the origin, of Adam Smith's invisible hand. Everyone act on their own. Everyone do whatever they want. Everyone's individually determined. There is an invisible hand which will somehow or other hold everything together. Do what you want. Enjoy yourself. Have fun. Don't worry. The best will come of it. In economics, this is the whole idea that it'll all be okay if everyone follows out on their own subjective demand function. Anyone who studied economics knows that demand in the individuals of the society, effective demand, meaning demand with a dollar bill attached to it, comes purely from the subjective desires of the individual. There is absolutely no basis for determining value beyond the summation of the subjective demands of the individual. Meaning, I like ice cream. He likes pie. She likes asparagus. And the summation of the subjective demands of society, of all these individuals who are expressing their personal heartfelt desires, is what creates the circumstances which supply then fills. And you have demand and then supply. People come along and produce the ice cream, the pies, and the what did I say, asparagus, which people like. I had an economics professor when I had the misfortune of studying economics who would have endless debates that it is completely impossible for anyone to determine an objective measure of value, because that's like deciding which is better, chocolate ice cream or vanilla. You say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. It's not a question of chocolate or vanilla. Obviously, chocolate is better. But beyond that, no one disagrees, right? It's in Plato. Plato says chocolate is better. Aristotle likes vanilla. No, but seriously, beyond that, the idea that there is no way of putting value on things beyond what personal desire is the same thing as cultural relativism, is saying, well, everyone's opinion is just as good. What do you like? Right? Oh, you're not in favor of marriages between people of opposite sexes? That's cool. Whatever you like. What's your subjective demand? You think people the same sex should be married together? That's cool. Oh, you think it's okay to do it with animals? That's cool. You got money? You got demand. No problem. That's your demand function? We'll supply it. Don't worry. Which is, of course, a complete farce, because the way it really happens is that subjective demand functions, so-called, are created by the David Humes of the world. They determine people's felt desires and tastes in things. British intelligence. But that's the theory on which it's based. And Lynn's famous quote from Adam Smith on morality, where Adam Smith says, just do whatever you want, be as immoral as you like, in the final analysis it'll all work out okay. God will take care of it. You don't have to worry about being moral. Do your thing. God will pull all the pieces together. He's the one. Just go about doing your business being a many, as frequently as you like, a multiple many. And this is the part that Lynn constantly cites from Adam Smith as the heart of his economic theory, which actually comes from the theory of the moral sentiments. I'm reading from Science of Christian Economy, which you've all read through, right? Since we discussed that many classes ago. And I will read this quote from Adam Smith, which will now take on new meaning to you, having seen where this comes from Aristotle, Hume, and so on and so forth. He says, "The administration of the great system of the universe and the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness, of that of his family, his friends, his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain, where have you heard that before, prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce them." Just do what your instincts tell you to do. Don't worry about the end to which the great director, God, is leading all of this. You don't have to worry about that. Do what you like. And of course, this whole approach, this Aristotelian Hume-Smith approach in Bentham then takes on the form of the hedonistic philosophic calculus, which is the summation of all private desires where everyone does whatever they feel like doing, gives you the public good. Isn't that nice? Automatically, by the invisible hand. And you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to feel bad when you do something immoral. You don't have to feel guilty. You can just let it all hang out, be completely unbridled, satisfy every pleasure that you want. It's all okay, because in the end it'll all turn out all right. Why? Custom and habit. The invisible hand. The philosophic calculus. Don't worry. Just do it. Somehow it'll all work out. And you will end up with Jeremy Bentham writing essays with titles such as In Defense of Usury and In Defense of Pederasty. Sex with Children. He wrote, well, it's logical. Why not? Once you get on the train with Aristotle, there's no getting off. That's where you're going to end up. And that's the logic of this whole thing. Counterpose that to the concept of the common good, the Platonic Christian concept of the common good. That there is a good, that there is natural law as knowable to man as the expression of that higher order common good, of that general good. That the ordering of nature is lawful, that it is knowable to man, that the many is ordered by the one, and that man is capable of conceptualizing this and ordering and defining his life according to those principles. Those are two completely contrary worldviews, two completely contrary economic systems that spring from this, and two completely contrary senses of individual identity that guide all of the many actions of our individual life. And on that note, with the alarm going off, it's the end of the points that I wanted to make. Jim?
I have a question about Hume and this whole array of British philosophers. Do you suppose that they really believed that stuff themselves, or were they using it to run the world? Because it seems to me, actually explicit in the system itself is failure. And so how
Is what?
Is failure as a system. And since they were the oligarchy, more or less, that was running the British Empire, for instance, it just seems curious that the empire has lasted this long if they really believed that crap.
No, I think they really believe it. I think that really is their view of man. I think that really is the way they think of the universe and themselves. I think they really do view themselves as the gods of Olympus. Yes, God may exist, but he's sort of one among us. We're also gods. We're the gods of Olympus. These are people who are infatuated with their own power and their ability to kill, destroy, create at will. They are like the gods of Olympus, and they view the world as being ordered that way. You see this in interesting questions that come up, like the question of science, right? The British approach to science, where at certain points in the history of the British Empire, when the development of actual scientific advances in other societies was threatening to put them out of business, under those circumstances and those circumstances alone, would they tolerate, and did they tolerate, the development of certain scientific, this is the whole, Wells, Bertrand Russell, that whole debate over whether to go with science or not. And they allowed the development of it to a certain degree so that they would have the product of it in order to not lose politically and lose factionally. But this was never something that they had self-conscious mastery or control over. They certainly knew that they wanted to stop this from spreading to the 95% of the population at all costs, and to guarantee that they didn't have access to it. But they also wanted to make sure that they, as an oligarchy, had different conditions of life for themselves. But I think that in terms of their actual view of the world and how they think about things, yeah, I think this really is the way their mind works. There's an element, you see, there's the thing that's difficult with this, that's disconcerting, is that there's an element of deliberate cheating in this. I mean, you read someone like Hume, and you take it seriously, and you follow the argument, and you read, at a certain point, the guy just cheats. I mean, he says things which are so outrageous and so transparent. It's not just that they're wrong and you disagree with them. It's just cheating. What do you mean? The guy's gone through 200 pages of contortions, developed out the consequences of his premises, which are all wrong. He reaches certain conclusions, and he says, forget all of that. Really, there's custom and habit. What is it? I don't know. But everyone agrees that it exists, so that's that. Philistinism. What's that?
I noticed that Aristotle does the same thing, right?
Yeah, same type of stuff. You run into a problem, you say, nah, forget it. So there's an element, there's sort of, it's the mind of the cheater. It's the mind of the cheater that think that they can get away with it. All right? And that's okay. So that's disconcerting in a certain way, because you wonder, well, does he really believe? Why is he cheating? Why doesn't he follow through the logical? Well, that cheating approach is actually part of the worldview. And the important thing in this is the implicit sense of concept of man that you have here, which is the concept of man as beast. Man is incapable of creative thought, and that creativity is ultimately completely unintelligible to man. And then they work to make sure that that is in fact the case.